Hello.
Bom, já estamos com as pessoas, a professora
So
Rachel.
now we have everyone here. Professor Rahel is here and Professor Suzana as well. So we're about to start our interview. Welcome here. It's an immense pleasure to have such important people here, and in the same screen, it honors me. And Professor Rachel Elior is the Emerite Professor of Judaic Philosophy and Judaic Mystic Thinking in the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. And currently, she's the head of the Department of the Judaic Thinking in the university, and she's also a researcher of the Center of Judaic Studies of the University of Oxford. She was awarded many things. I won't describe all of them, or else we would take half the time that we have available here in our interview. But I'd like to highlight one, which was in the International Day of Women's Day in 2017, the award Hitsu for Jerusalem, and Jewish women know how important that is for innovative women and what she represents in the academic field as well as in the dissemination of knowledge. So her main topics of research are around Hasidism and Judaic mystic, and also the topic that we're going to talk about today, which is the absence and the presence of women in Judaic culture and in religious tradition as well, and liberty and secular Judaism. These are topics that she researches. She's an author of many different books that have been published in many different languages. So if you wanna Google Rachel Elior on Amazon, actually, you'll see many different pages of many different books, of dozens of books that were published in English, in Hebrew, in Yiddish, in Polish, in German, in Spanish. That is a huge number of languages, and that demonstrates how much the thinking of Rachel Elior is of world international interest. And Rachel Elior will be interviewed today for our dear Suzana Chwarts. Suzana is a person that, as a child, fell in love with the Hebrew Bible when she was in the Israelite college, school in Recife, her hometown, and then she went to Israel to study biblical archaeology at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, and culture and language and the Middle East culture, all ancient Middle East culture, as well as political journalism in the University of Tel Aviv. Currently, she's a professor of interdisciplinary studies of the Hebrew Bible in the FFLH in USP. She's the director of the Center of Judaic Studies as well, and it's a very big pride to have her here as the professor and the institutional partnership that she represents. And as well as Rachel Elior, Suzana Chwarts also has interest research in common such as women and the feminine in the Hebrew Bible and Kabbalah. She's also a published author on the book The View of Sterility in the Hebrew Bible and other topics. And this interview is focusing two different topics: the absence of writer women in the Judaic library. We know that the Jewish library is huge, and we have a gap of women writers in the old literature, in Aramaic and Hebrew, and the early stage in presence of women in Tanakh and Tanakh, Mishnah, Talmud, and Bavli as well, and the presence here of generations of illiterate women also. And that's what we want to talk about here today. It is an innovation and a topic that stands out. This absence is super relevant, and the presence that should be commended is mentioned in which is the presence of the women's illiteracy, meaning this deprivation of the access to knowledge. So this meeting is co-organized by the Judaic Center of Studies of USP with the Jewish Academy, with the support Bogrim from Hazit Anoa, and it's also supported by many Jewish organizations that participated in disseminations and in other aspects of logistics. And I'd like to remind you that if you join the Zoom after at the beginning, we have simultaneous interpretation, and Professor Rachel Elior will be speaking in English, and you will just have to click on the globe, the icon globe to select the language of your preference. And now we welcome everyone who's also through YouTube, be it whether in the English channel or in the Portuguese channel through YouTube or Facebook, and the CIP social networks. And now I pass the floor to Professor Dr. Chwarts, and after this such a long introduction, and now she will start the interview with our illustrious guest, Rachel Elior, that will speak about her most recent book that deals in the unknown history of Jewish women over time, relationship between illiteracy and learning, slavery, and this modern aspect.
Thank you, Kelita, for your words. In my case, very kind words. Shalom, Rachel. Can't say how glad I am to see you again online, though. And it's a pleasure to interview you today on your last book. This is the book. Can you see? The Unknown History of Jewish Women Through the Ages. I wish to focus, first of all, in the very shocking subtitle of the book, on learning and illiteracy, on slavery and liberty. The word illiteracy comes as a shock because we all know that education and knowledge are central values in the Jewish world throughout the ages. And we know from archaeological evidence that the level of literacy in Israel was very high in biblical times. We know from the Talmud that education was a public responsibility of the community. We know about Shimon ben Shetach, the founder of the primary schools, the Batei Sefer all over Israel, and that in Jerusalem in the first century AD, there was at least 460 synagogues, and each one had a Beit Sefer for the study of Torah and a Beit Talmud for the study of Mishnah. So Rachel, how come Jewish women were illiterate through the ages? After all, are we or are we not the people of the book?
Thank you, Suzana. I'm very glad to be here, and I'm very glad to see you. And we'll start with the very hard question: how come that the people of the book had cherished knowledge and literacy only for men and denied it from women? It's really a tragedy, because the men of every Jewish community had enjoyed tremendous access to study from childhood. It was a common knowledge that every Jewish boy has to go to school from the age of 3 to the age of 13, or from the age of 4 to the age of 14, for a time span of 10 years of study of reading Hebrew, only Hebrew. And by the time that the child learned to read Hebrew and he was able to read the Bible and the Siddur and later on the Mishnah, he would be able to learn other languages and other topics. But first of all, it was taken for granted that every boy would be literate. But at a very early stage, the sages said that only boys have to learn while daughters had to be denied any access to learning. It was a tragedy because if we would have allowed women to study exactly as we allowed men, the situation, the historical situation would have been utterly different. But when we denied women in every age the right to learn to read in Hebrew, we denied them not only access to the holy text of the Jewish people, we denied them the opportunity to share in the cultural heritage, to share in expressing their opinions, to share with leadership, with legislation, with creativity, with social order. They were kept at home. They were not allowed to be part of the public discourse, and it's really tragic.
Well, let's focus on the perception of women in Jewish society. I have two questions regarding that. First, was there a specific perception of women as being intellectually incapable or inferior or lightheaded? The second question has to do with negative feminine stereotypes. We know that words create reality, especially the words of a myth, like the biblical myth of Eve and the serpent. How did the growing eroticization of two founding myths, the myth of Eve and the myth of Lilith, in Agadah, in Midrash, contributed to a perception of women as essentially ambivalent, seductresses, and dangerous, associated with sin, with death, and the Sitra Achra, the Kabbalistic other side, the demoniacal side.
O som da Rachel não se ouve. We cannot hear Rachel.
Rachel, wait a minute. We're being told that we can't hear you well. Could
Yes.
you increase the volume of your computer?
What's the problem?
לא ניתן לשמוע ממש טוב, אומרים שזה נורא נמוך, ואולי את צריכה להעלות את הווליום במחשב.
Suzana, a gente escuta ela perfeitamente.
Well, now
מי שמארגן את זה יכול להרשות לי לעשות שיתוף מסך, share screen?
Now people are writing down that they are hearing you perfectly, so I don't know, maybe the interpretation is very low, but no, this is not Rachel's problem.
No, the interpretation.
Can you hear me?
Yes, very well, very well. Maybe the person who doesn't hear has to raise its microphone, her or his microphone.
You hear people? Got it, guys? You have to increase the volume of your computers and see.
Suzana, a sua voz está muito nítida e a de
Suzana, your voice is very clear. Rachel is not so clear. It's not so loud, and her voice. I turned up all the way the volume.
Well, I will try. Do you hear me well now?
O intérprete está conseguindo ouvir bem e o nível do volume está estável. Então, se alguém tiver dificuldade e quiser passar para o canal de português, também tem essa opção de áudio, tá?
Rachel, say something, please, so people will tell us if they're hearing you perfectly.
I heard the translator very well, and I hear you very well. So I don't know there is a problem.
Yeah. Well, let's go on with the interview, please. Please, Rachel.
Okay, you started by asking, how did it happen?
Cagou mesmo, cara. Já encerrasse, mas cagou na minha barriga, cara. Eu tava comendo o cu dela e a gente tinha comido uma feijoada.
Rachel,
E aí a gente tava chamado até Pompadour. Entendeu? Pode jogar.
Is something... Kelita, did you hear that? We had like a difference from exterior people, but it's okay. Can we go on?
I hope so. Go ahead.
אנשים נכנסים לכל מיני... טוב, יאללה, נו. Please, Rachel.
Okay. We discussed the course of events that made women different or other or not like everybody else. And that begins in a very early stage. In the book of Genesis, in the story of the Garden of Eden, we are told that God is cursing Adam for the sin of Adam and Eve, for the sin of eating the forbidden fruit. All the details of the curse doesn't really matter with the exception of one sentence. Eve is being told that she should be subjugated to her husband, Adam. It is said that, and he will rule over thee. I think it's a tragedy. I think it's something that we need to understand, that ancient mythology has a great effect on legal status. The story of Garden of Eden, of course, it's a myth. It's a myth that telling us what had happened in ancient times, times that we don't have access to, times that we cannot read, doing. I see that people say that there is a problem with the microphone. I don't really know what to do about it. Just 1 second. Let's hope that now it is better, maybe. Going back to the mythology. Mythology is never a simple story or a pure story. It's a story with an intention. The intention of the myth of Adam and Eve was to clarify the situation, who is in charge, who is on top. And it is said, and he will rule over you. That means that there is no equality between men and women that were created equally according to one version or created one after the other according to another version. But the very short sentence, and he will rule over you, made it a hegemonic relations, a dominant relations of domination. And men were very eager to tell women how to be dominated. And the first thing they did in order to dominate them was to prevent them from the capacity of learning to read and write. It is important to remember that the only other group that was not allowed to read and write were slaves. Slaves and women were very much alike. Both of them were not allowed to learn to read and write. Both of them were not allowed to have an inheritance. Both of them were subjugated to the whip of their owners. Both of them were unequal, and both of them were part of the pater familia. What happened now? Suzana, can you hear me?
Yes, there was an interference, but it was neutralized.
Okay, very well. So anyhow, by the mythology of the story of Garden of Eden, Adam had become the dominion or the dominator of Eve, and thus all men were the rulers of the ruled women. So the story of the mythology of the Garden of Eden, which is in the very beginning of Genesis, served as the basis of putting women out of the social order. They were not equal members of the community. They were subjugated members of the community. Every woman was under the subjugation of her father until she got married, and of her husband since she got married. I would like, with your permission, to read one short section. First of all, Genesis. I will make your pains in childbearing very severe. With painful labor, you will give birth to children. Your desire will be for your husband, and he shall rule over you. That is Genesis 3:16. I would like to read the way that Flavius Josephus had interpreted that sentence. He said, a woman, says the scripture, is inferior to a man in all respects. So let her obey, not that she may be abused, but that she may be ruled, for God has given power to the man. Another version of the translation says, but then what are our laws about marriage? I skip. For, says the scripture, a woman is inferior to her husband in all things. Let her therefore be obedient to him, not so that he should abuse her, but that she may acknowledge her duty to her husband, for God has given the authority to the husband. That saying, or that situation, was the basis of tragic life of all women, because the women were subjugated, they never had freedom, they never had freedom of choice, freedom of movement, freedom of study, freedom of creativity, freedom of engagement in the social arena. They had to be at home. They had to be serving their husbands, raising children, and if they would not do so, they would be punished severely. Not only Eve, the punished Eve, was described as the prototype of all women, as a sinner, as a punished one, as an evil one. Her image was developing in a very, very negative way. You mentioned before that women were, how they were described as seductive or as adulterous or as dangerous. It wasn't only Eve, it was Eve and Lilith. Lilith was considered to be the first Eve. In Hebrew, we call her Lilith. In English, we call her Lilith. She is like a representation of Eve as an absolute sinner. There are two different types. One is Eve and one is Lilith, but both of them are sinners, both of them are seductress, both of them are punished, and the image of Lilith was growing endlessly towards unbelievable directions. So women, flesh and blood women, were described according to their ancient first mother, Eve, or according to her other image as Lilith, as a sinner, as a threater, as an adulteress, as a punished one, and all kinds of mythological stories were told. So men would say, you see, all women are sinners, all women are to be punished, all women have to be chained, all women have to be subjugated. Mythology was the background for the legal structure that subjugated women.
Amazing. Well, let's focus now on what is valued in the Jewish world. We kind of know the answer to this question. Knowledge. Knowledge is valued above all other assets, and not just any knowledge, but the knowledge of our culture, of the Bible, of the Mishnah, the Talmud, all legal and literary commentaries, written in Hebrew, the Lashon HaKodesh, the Holy Tongue, and Aramaic. But we know now that women had no access to this written public culture. So what is valued in a Jewish woman? And to use the wording of the famous Talmudic debate, how can a woman get married?
Well, women were expected to obey their husbands, to serve their children, to be subjugated to all the needs of the house with no exception, to do daily her cleaning and cooking and washing and rearing children and doing the laundry and ironing and doing all the kitchen work. And we should remember that in most places in the world, there were no running water and there was certainly no electricity before the early 20th century. So housework was much harder than what we consider housework today. With technology, with electricity, with running water, all those assets were not available. But women, being as slaves, were expected to do everything of all those works. I would like to read the exact words one second. The word family that we're all familiar with are coming from the Latin word familia, family of servants, domestic, collectively, the servants in a household. That's the meaning of the word family or familia. Thus, also members of a household or the estate property, the household including relatives and servants. Abstract noun from famulus, F-A-M-U-L-U-S, servant, slave, which is of unknown origin. So the word family relates to the family of slaves and everyone who is living under the rule of the master. The master was allowed to compel anyone with a whip to do all their houseworks, slave and woman allowed, slaves and women alike. Now, Maimonides in Mishneh Torah, in Hilchot Ishut, said it very bluntly. For any woman who fails to perform one of the tasks required of her by her husband is compelled even with the whip. I'll read it one more time. For any woman who fails to perform one of the tasks required of her by her husband is compelled even with the whip. In Hebrew, kofin ota bashot. She was like a slave. She didn't have the choice to do what she liked. She had to do only what she was told. Maimonides further said, women, slaves, and minors are exempt from the commandment of Torah study. And although she is rewarded if she studies, the rabbis decreed in Bavli Sotah that a man should not teach his daughter Torah because the minds of most women are not attuned to learning, and in the deficiency of their minds will interpret the words of the Torah in a trivial fashion. The sages said, he who teaches his daughter Torah, it is as if he taught her licentiousness. To what does this refer? To the oral law. Regarding the written law, however, he should not teach her to begin with. But if he has taught her, it is not as if he has taught her licentiousness. That's Maimonides.
This is Maimonides.
Yes, Maimonides, Mishneh Torah, Hilchot Talmud Torah. So if we have the woman as a completely illiterate and is subjugated to the whip of her husband, who can compel her to do any housework by the whip because she owes it to him, her only merits would be obedience and servitude. She should do whatever she is expected to do, whatever she is told to do. In her own home, she should be respected, but it is like a coincidentia oppositum. You cannot consider yourself as a respectful person if somebody has the right to compel you with a whip. You cannot consider yourself a respectful person if someone is compelling you not to study and keeps you illiterate. A woman is highly praised for taking care of her children, to bring the children to Talmud Torah, but she herself is not allowed to hear or to study any portions of the Torah. So women had very tragic destiny.
Quite amazing. Well,
it is tragic. More than amazing, it is tragic, because women were denied from every opportunity to shape their destiny, to take part of the public conversation of the Jewish community. Women who were illiterate were not allowed to be students or teachers or leaders, or to serve in the holy services, or to lead a prayer, or to read in the Torah, or to participate in anything that the Jewish people loved so much and valued so much. Everything of value, like study, like prayer, like teaching, like interpreting, like transmitting knowledge, was only kept for men, not for women.
It reminds me that in the first page of your book, you cited Primo Levi, and he says that the special talent, I'm paraphrasing here, the special talent of the Jewish people is literacy, and it is their duty, it is a necessity, and it is the pleasure of life. So Jewish women were banned, kept apart from the pleasure of life in Jewish conception. This is exact. Rachel, the fourth question. I guess it's time we hear some divergent voices. I know for a fact that Judaism...
One moment, Suzana, I would like, with your permission, to read the exact words of Primo Levi. They're so beautiful. Primo Levi, as you know, was a fantastic Italian Jewish author. He was born in 1919 and he passed away in 1987. He's telling about, in a book called Jews in Torino, he says, when our fathers moved to the city of Turin towards the end of the 19th century, they brought with them the great, maybe the only special talent that history bequested to the Jews, literacy, a secular and religious culture seen as a duty, a necessity, a pleasure of life, at a time when most Italians were illiterate. Now, that's exactly the point. Women were denied of literacy, of secular and religious culture, seen as a duty, as a necessity, and as a pleasure of life, at a time when most Italians, for most other people in the world, were illiterate. So literacy that was valued so dearly by the Jews were kept only for the male part of the population. And the women were told, well, you can do some charity, you can do some cleanliness, you can do some child rearing, but you can never express any opinion, any knowledge, any public discourse. You have to be silent and obedient, and at home, not being allowed to engage in anything of your own choice. This is the tragedy of the Jewish history of women. And we should remember that it starts in a very early stage. In the whole entire biblical anthology, in the whole entire Tanakh, in the 24 holy books, there is not a single sentence told by a daughter to her mother or by a mother to her daughter. Only men are speaking. Well, of course, there are other women, there are the mothers, there are sisters, but the dialogue between mothers and daughters does not exist. Women don't have voices. They are described as part of the story of the fathers. They are not part of the story, of the history of the nation. Other than the mothers, Sarah, Rachel, Leah, Rivka, there is no other voices of mothers and daughters. When we talk about the children of Jacob, we talk only about the 12 sons of Jacob. We tend to forget Dinah because every generation, starting from Genesis 5, we count only the men and not the women. We are told that this is the story of the book of Adam in Genesis 5, and we are told that Adam gave birth. Adam was the father of course, Cain and Abel. That was the beginning of the tragedy. One son was killed, the other one was a murderer, and humanity starts with Seth. Seth is the father of Enosh, and Enosh of Mahalalel, and Mahalalel of Canaan, and Canaan of Yered, and Yered of Hanoch, and so on and so forth until Noah. There are no mothers mentioned. History is only his story, not her story. Only men are telling history. Only men decide what is important. Only the voices of the fathers, of the thousands of people who are mentioned in the Bible, are usually taken into consideration. No voice of female as a daughter, as a mother, is rarely being accounted for.
Yes. The fourth question I have to you has to do with the divergent voices. We know for a fact that Judaism has never been, hopefully will never be, monolithic. Quite the contrary, the whole Talmud is an open debate. We know from the Mishnah that Shimon ben Azai opposed Eliezer ben Hirkanus regarding teaching Torah to the daughters. And Rashi in the 10th century sided with women on the subject of ritual impurity in the synagogue, women going to the synagogue while impure ritually. And Rabbeinu Gershom, Meor HaGolah, the light of the diaspora, and he really deserved this title, having issued a ban on polygamy and the need of the consent of both wife and husband to a divorce. Please tell us about these early feminists. Tell us also about Shabbatai Tzvi, the false messiah of the 12th century, kind of a villain in Judaism. But you argue in the book, it's very interesting and surprising that he had very liberating views on women and the feminine. And beside Rabbeinu Gershom, had those divergent voices any real impact in the actual lives of Jewish women?
Yes, thank you for this important question, because every generalization always had to be controlled by accepting the exception. So the rule was that most Jewish women were never had an opportunity to live as literate, equal members of the community. But there were exceptions, and you mentioned some of the names of people who made change, who made an exception. So let's start by Rashi. Rashi, who lived in the turn of the second millennium, had only daughters. So unlike the rule of the sages that daughters should not be taught to learn to read and write, Rashi said, I have such a wonderful collection of manuscripts. I would love my daughters to help me to copy manuscripts. I would be so happy if my daughter can help me in reading the manuscript, and I will write, or I will read it to her and she will write. It would be so helpful that someone can help me with reading and writing. He had very wise daughters. You know, they were the daughters of Rashi. I don't know much about his wife, but Rashi was certainly a very brilliant Jew. And he had very brilliant daughters. He taught all of them because he didn't have boys, he had only girls. The daughters of Rashi are the mothers of Baalei HaTosafot, the leaders of the 12th and 13th century Jewish communities in Europe. But Rashi, in general, according to Professor Avraham Grossman and other scholars of Rashi, had a very positive attitude towards women in general, and wherever there was a possibility to rule for their favor, he would do that. But it wasn't only him. Before him, there was Rabbeinu Gershon Maor HaGola, who was considered to be the light of exile because he made a very important innovation. According to biblical law, every man is allowed to marry few women. You know, Jacob had 2 wives and other 2 like wives, and Abraham had a few wives. And the idea of bigamy or polygamy was completely legal and accepted in biblical history. It was also accepted in the first millennium in the Muslim world and in the second millennium. But Rabbeinu Gershon Maor HaGola, the light of the diaspora, had ruled that in the Christian world, as Christianity did not allow bigamy and insisted on monogamy, Jews should behave like their neighbors, and they should have only 1 wife and not 2 or 3 or 4. There were many rabbis who protested against him. They said, we don't accept it. We like our own habits, the biblical habits of having a few wives, not 1. But Rabbeinu Gershom said that all the Jews in the Ashkenazi community must subjugate to his ruling that only 1 wife is allowed. Now, this is of great importance. But when 1,000 years later, when waves of immigrations came from Asia and North Africa and Yemen and Iran, quite a few families from the Muslim world came with polygamic families or bigamic families. They never accepted the ruling of Rabbeinu Gershon, who was the authority in Ashkenaz. So we had 2 perceptions of structure of family. The biblical structure, which definitely allows polygamy, and the Western Christian world, the Ashkenazi world, which denied this law. In Israel, polygamy is prohibited by law, with the exception of the Muslim community and the exception of the Bedouin community. So there is an acknowledgement of such a thing. For women, of course, it's bad enough, it's hard enough to be married to 1 man that you're subjugated to, but to have a few women together who are subjugated to the man is not easy life, especially when when children are born, and the preference of the father to children of 1 wife upon the other is not promising a very peaceful life. So Rabbeinu Gershon should be remembered for his ruling that 1 is not allowed to open other people's envelopes of letters, and 1 should not marry more than 1 wife. Let us remember the unexpected first Jewish feminist. His name was Shabbatai Tzvi. You all heard about Shabbatai Tzvi as a false messiah, but very few of you heard about him as the very first feminist. We have a very fascinating account of the scathing criticism leveled by Shabbatai Tzvi in the 17th century against the condition of women in Ottoman Jewish society, and that could be found in a book written by Thomas Kunen, who was a Dutch minister of the Dutch Reformed Church, who served members of the Dutch merchants community in Smyrna, in the Smyrna, in the last third of the 17th century. Kunen is considered to be a very reliable source by scholars of that period, provides an eyewitness account of Sabbatai Tzvi behavior in that city of Smyrna, in a booklet published in Dutch in 1668 and translated into Hebrew in 1998. And the following passage is in English, translated from the Hebrew. So from here on is the language of Sabbatai Tzvi. He said the following. He further sought to attract, he is Sabbatai Tzvi. Sabbatai Tzvi further sought to attract the affection of the women and to ingratiate himself with them. When he was in their company, he was wont to quote Psalms 45, "King's daughters were among your honorable women. Upon your right hand did stand the queen in gold of Ophir," adding, that was a quote, and here he added, "And you wretched women, how miserable you are, that on account of Eve, your pain is so great when you give birth, and what is more, you are subjugated to your husbands and cannot do anything great or small without their consent," and so forth. But praise God that I, Sabbatai Tzvi, but praise God that I have come into the world to deliver you from all of your afflictions, to free you and make you happy like your husbands, for I have come to annul the sin of Adam. Now, this is really a wonderful quotation, because Sabbatai Tzvi is the first man who says, I acknowledge your suffering, I acknowledge your bitter life, I acknowledge the injustice of Jewish women in Jewish community. He considered himself to be a Messiah. I came to change the situation, because the Messianic idea is a very simple sentence. Everything could be different. So Sabbatai Tzvi wanted to start the change of things being different by annulling the sin of the first Adam and Eve. And since he would annul or cancel the sin, he would be able to start a free world, a new world where men and women are equal. He was the very first Jewish feminist, and maybe the first feminist in general in the world, but that he was the first Jewish feminist, there is no doubt about that.
And Rachel, do you think that the notion of Shekhinah and like the feminine side of God, or realization of God that lives with the Jewish people, changed anything for Jewish women? Such a feminist, such a wonderful notion. Is it only in the level of ideas and ashlayot, and not really made any difference?
Well, it's a very interesting question that I would love to answer in a positive way, but unfortunately, while the idea of the Shekhinah was very beautiful and developing in all directions, it had nothing to do with real Jewish women. Now, what is the Shekhinah? In ancient times, in the destruction of the first temple in the 6th century before the Common Era, the voice of the daughter of Zion is the very beginning of acknowledgement of a female voice of a nobody. That's a voice with no body, exactly as God is a voice with no body. Now, God has a male voice, because in the Hebrew language, there is no neutral form. Every verb and every adjective has to be conjugated in a way that would reflect the question, is that a male voice or is that a female voice? God's voice is always, with no exception, is always a male voice. The idea of a voice of a female kind, of an image with no body, was first introduced in the Scroll of Lamentations in Eicha, that we read in 9th of Ab upon the destruction of the temple. This voice was the foundation of the voice of the Shekhinah. When Second Temple was destroyed, many years later, the voice of the lamentation of the first temple had been developed into the image of the Shekhinah. Shekhinah means just dwelling, but the contribution of the Kabbalah was that anthropomorphization of the deity. That means from now on, since the idea of the Shekhinah was introduced, in heaven we have two voices, one male voice and one female voice. Female voice would be like feminine, caressing voice, supporting voice, nurturing voice, counseling voice, offering consolation. We are told that wherever the Jewish people went on exile, the Shekhinah went with them. Whenever 10 Jewish men are praying, the Shekhinah is in their presence. Wherever 3 Jewish men are studying, the Shekhinah is amongst them. So the Shekhinah is the divine presence of the Jewish people in exile. It had nothing to do with Jewish woman, basar vadam, with flesh and blood Jewish woman. It was only consolation for men, not for women, because women were not allowed to study not only the Bible, but certainly not the Talmud, and not the Midrashim, and not the Kabbalah, and not the poetry. They were not part of the conversation, as I said time and again.
Still about the divergent. Let's talk about divergent realities, real women, not ideas, not principles. We know of some exceptional scholar women. Everybody in the chat already is they're writing, what about the rabbi wives and Beruria? Okay, so we got to them. From the Talmud, we know the wonderful scholar women, Ima Shalom and Beruria and Yalta. We know of the 15th century Rabbanit Meresina of Gerona, Spain, and 16th century Rabbanit Aznat Barzani from Kurdistan, who even received the title Tanait as the great Talmudic sages and was head of a yeshiva when her father and husband died. The daughters of Rashi, be it legend or not, were reputed to be learned and even to wear tefillin. Please clarify this fact for us. And on the other side, you cite in your book ordinary women of the responsa. Just a parenthesis for the public, the responsa is an exchange of letters on legal matters, like sort of ask the rabbi in medieval Judaism. And the women in those letters were ordinary women who could actually read and write and even teach.
Well, in every century, we do have some hints or some memories about women which were exceptional. That is, they were not part of the illiterate crowd of women, but they were exceptional, and usually just about with no exception. Those exceptional women would be daughters of rabbis who did not have sons, who wanted to bequeath their library to their daughters, thus teaching them to read and write, because they had no men. They had no boys of the male kind, they had girls of the female kind. So you mentioned Rabbanit Osnat, for instance. Rabbanit Osnat, or Tanait Osnat, was a woman from Mosul of Iraq, Kurdistan, of the 17th century. She was one daughter of a very renowned rabbi of this area, Kurdistan, Turkey, Iraq, this area. And she wrote a few letters to ask for support. So thus we know that she was very well educated. She was very well read and very well writing in a very nice style. And she was able to ask in a very highly rabbinical style for help for her yeshiva, because she was running a yeshiva after her father passed away and after her husband passed away. She found herself with a treasure of knowledge, library and students and teaching and manuscripts, but she lacked funds to to run the yeshiva. So she was writing, but we don't have any other woman in the whole entire Jewish history who ran a yeshiva. So Tanait Osnat Barazani was an exception that just shows us that women could always study if only they would be given a chance. But since men always wanted to have exclusive authority of knowledge of any kind, 99% of women would never had any access to any knowledge. The exclusive authority of knowledge.
15 horas.
Sorry?
It's my computer. It talks to itself. Please forgive me.
So anyhow, Rabbanit Osnat was an exception. There is another woman known of the Shapira family that was a rabbinical authority, but she was not conducting a yeshiva. She was taking part in the conversation of Talmidei Chachamim. She sat behind the screen and she heard the conversation, and she would contribute her opinions about laws of purity, about laws pertaining to women. We have a few examples of women who were educated, as I said, usually only women who were single daughters of educated fathers, and they would be very eager and very curious, and as soon as they were learning to read and write in the holy language, they would be engaged in studies. We have a lovely testimony of a woman of the 18th century called Sarah Rivka Leah Rachel, daughter of Rabbi Yaakov Horovitz from Brody, who is described in a diary of a simple man who was studying with her father. Rav Dov Ber Birkenthal was a student with her father, but when her father or her brother were away or where they were not able to help the student, the student was moaning that he was not able to answer the questions that he was asked, she would ask him, "Why are you moaning? Why are you crying? Ask me, I would answer." And she knew the whole entire Talmud by heart. So he said, it's an exaggeration. But she was able to answer by heart every question that the student had. In the memories of Rav Dov Ber Bolechov, there is this description of the very smart daughter of the rabbi who was able to help him. In the Gniza, treasures which reflect the life of Jews in Cairo at the end of the first millennium and in the turn of the second millennium, we have many documents that describe life of Jewish women. So, few of them were known to be teachers. They would teach the children to learn to read and write. How that would be if they were not allowed to learn to read and write, they would have an exception. They would be married to a husband who is blind and he needed their help. Or they would be daughters of scholars, as I said. Or we have some memories in the Geniza papers where it is said that a woman may write her bill of divorce if nobody else is able to do so. In tragic Jewish history, where there are persecutions, where there were all kinds of abnormal conditions of life, women who knew to read and write would be asked to perform acts of charity or acts of legal things if there were no men around. But most women were illiterate. Very few women would be an exception that attest the fact that as soon as you give women the opportunity to learn, they can engage in any scholarly engagement which raise their attention or which is beloved by them. We had in Morocco, we had a woman known as Frecha Bat Yosef, who was a poet. She wrote beautiful poems before she was killed or murdered in one of the pogroms that were taking place there. Her poetry was published by Rina Cohen Melamed and Uri Cohen Melamed, and we have the opportunity to see that there were women poets, there were women rabbis, there were women scholars, and we have the very famous story of the maid of Ludomir in the 18th century, where a woman wanted to be a tzaddik. We know tzaddikim from the Hasidic history. Most of them, all of them were men, of course, but there was one single woman who wanted to be a tzaddik. She was, again, a single daughter to a very well-to-do family Her mother passed away. She was involved with very tragic mourning. And when she came out of her mourning, she said, I am not a woman anymore. I'm a tzaddik. I want to teach. You will not see me. I will teach behind the screen. You would listen to my classes, but you would not see me. And she had followers, but the rabbis of Ruzhin that she was acting in their own area were very resentful against her, and they said she's insane, she was taken by possession, she has a dibuk, and they made everything in their capacity to enforce her to get married, so she would not be a maid anymore, she would be a married woman, and she would have no purity and no spiritual capacity, because married women would not be able to teach or to study or anything like that. So there were exceptions, but usually they would be tragic exceptions. And it's interesting to know that Henrietta Sold and Bertha Pappenheim were exceptional women in the 19th century and the 20th century. Both of them chose not to marry, to be free of any husband subjugation. They made a decision that their freedom and knowledge and scholarly endeavors are much more important than having a family. There are few women like that would choose the opportunity to study and to become a scholar rather than to be a traditional Jewish woman.
Okay, which leads us to the next question. How, when, and why things began to change for Jewish women, for ordinary Jewish women?
Well, as soon as opportunity for going to school were open to women all over the world, not only for Jewish women enjoyed the opportunity. Now, how that happened? First of all, let's remind ourselves that most people until the 19th century had no opportunity to go to school. It is true in England, it is true in Germany, it's true in Poland. Most people didn't have the opportunity to go to school, and if they had, it would be no more than elementary school. And the one exception, interestingly, was in Scotland. In Scotland, in an early stage in the days of King James, he said that wherever there is a church, there would be a school. At the beginning for youngsters, later on for first elementary school, then later for a high school, later for colleges. Scotland was the most educated country in Europe. In England, it wasn't so, and they had the right to go to school only in 1900, like at the very beginning of the 20th century. Unbelievable. It's hard to us to believe that most people who left from Italy to the United States, those who came like Italians, Christian Italians, were illiterate. Illiteracy was very common all over the world, with the exception of Jewish male population. But Jewish female population had the opportunity to study in the 19th century. How that happened? First of all, there was the Great Spring of Nations in 1848, and feminist organizations started to emerge because they wanted to have freedom for Black people who were enslaved and for women who were denied rights of inheritance, of study, of legal status, and so on and so forth. So in Seneca Falls in 1848, American women, Christian and Jewish alike, were convened together to talk about the demand of getting women equality and freedom. It is not known, and that's unfortunate fact, it is not known that the French Revolution did not include women among the citizens. Only men were citizens, equal citizens in the French Revolution. The American Revolution never included women in the Declaration of Independence. It was only men, white men with means, who were included within the Declaration of Rights. Women had no rights, none whatsoever. When the idea of citizenship was introduced in the US or in the French Revolution, the French women were becoming a citizen. That means they had the right to elect and to be elected only in 1944. It's unbelievable. In Switzerland, they had the right to be elected, to elect only in 1972. Women were not citizens, but in 1848, they demanded, in Seneca Falls, American women, they demanded to be part of the Declaration of Independence. Nobody listened to them, none whatsoever. But they wrote a very moving declaration called the Declaration of Sentiments, which I bring in my book at full, and they said, include us in all the fantastic privileges and rights that you gave men in the Declaration of Independence of the US. As I said, nobody listened to them. They insisted that Black people would be freed from slavery, because slavery of Black people and slavery of women were very much similar. Both were not allowed to engage in course of studies or in free movement, or in right of inheritance, or in right of election and be elected. So they said, let us and the Black people be freed from slavery. Again, nobody listened. But in 1861, when the Civil War in the United States started, and after 4 years, in 1865, the Black slaves were free, the women said, and now that we got the freedom of the slaves, we want freedom for ourselves as well. They started to build educational institutions for women to study, and slowly, slowly, they would enlarge the scope of study. At the beginning, it would be like elementary school, later on as high schools, later on as colleges, only for women. It was only at 1969 that women were accepted as equal in the Ivy League institutions in the United States. In 1948 in England, before they could study in secluded colleges, only of women, but being accepted as equal students that could be accepted according to their merits, not according to numerous clauses of their sex, that was only in the middle of the 20th century. So women understood that the key for equalization and changing history is education. As soon as any opportunity of education was opened, in Russia in 1917, education was offered for everyone, and Russian women were running, Jewish and non-Jewish alike, were running for institutions of education. Jewish women from Russia ran to Switzerland before the communist revolution, because Switzerland allowed women to study medicine at the end of the 19th century already. Women from all over Europe would go to study medicine and mathematics in European universities that had started at the very end of the 19th century to allow women to study. So the more women had access to study, the more women were feminist activists. Of course, not every woman who studied was a feminist activist, but every woman who had feminist insights or feminist hopes and feminist dreams. And feminism is just humanism for women, equality for women, human rights, human dignity for women, exactly as men. It's no more than that. It's the idea that women are human beings. Educated women were fighting for it, not for themselves, for all women. But the legislation for women as equal human beings was unanimously declared only in 1948 in the Bill of Rights of the United Nations, that insisted that all people who are born, men and women alike, are free people, deserve to be respectfully treated, deserve to have the right to live in freedom, security, and so on and so forth. But as we know, history did not support that, and many women in the world are still under Taliban kind enforcement or Muslim fanaticism rule, or African tribes fighting one against the other, raping women, and so on and so forth in every continent. So there is a long way yet to go, but we need to understand that education is the golden way for women equality. The more women have access to education, the more equal rights they have chance to gain.
Very good. Okay. Let's go back to the beginning for a while and focus on the title of your book, The Unknown History of Jewish Women. Right in the middle of your book, page 435 to be exact, you wrote a footnote, and I quote, "In a survey I conducted among friends and acquaintances in Jerusalem in their 60s and 70s, I discovered that most of their grandmothers from various countries were illiterate." End of quote. Well, I understand from the Hebrew title of your book, Lo yada kro uchtov, grandma didn't know how to read and write, that in spite of all the changes we just talked about, generations of Jewish women from Eastern and Western countries were completely analphabetic. Please tell us about your survey and also about the official measures took by the State of Israel in order to eradicate analphabetism and ignorance.
Thank you for this question, because one of the most amazing things that affected my interest in the question was that when I was a youngster in the 60s, I was recruited to the army in 1967, but between 1964 to 1967, I was participating in a project known as Bi'ur Ba'arut, eradicating illiteracy. But before I would continue, with your permission, I would like to read a quote from Chaim Be'er. You know, the title of my Hebrew book is Savta lo yad'a kro uchtov. Grandmother didn't know how to read and write. I took it from Chaim Be'er book, which is called Chavalim in Hebrew, or ropes, and in English it is called The Pure Element of Time. Chaim Be'er was born to a mother from the old settlement in Jerusalem, and he is describing the mother of his mother. He was born in 1945, and in his autobiographical novel, The Pure Element of Time, he's talking about his grandmother. And so he says, grandmother, who was about 80 years old at the time I'm talking about, did not know how to read and write until she was 50. Even today, many years after her death, it's still hard for me to utter the words grandmother was illiterate. With the force of their faith, the zealous and pious men who ruled her life, first her father and then her husband, deprived her of the right reserved solely for them, the right to acquire knowledge. It is important to understand that being deprived of the right to acquire knowledge was common to women of all Jewish communities. Let us not make the mistake that only people who came from one community or another community, people of all communities, had very high percentage of illiteracy, or if we would reverse it, the only place that women were literate where schools for women were open, and it doesn't matter in which continent. As soon as a school for women was opened, women would be literate. But, for instance, in Poland, the only first school for religious women, youngsters, would be Beis Yaakov, which was established in Krakow in 1917. 1917. Jewish young women who wanted to study, and they wanted very much to study because they wanted to go to the Jagiellonian University. They were not allowed by their fathers of the traditional world even to think about it. Some of them ran away to the monasteries with no intention of any religious interest. They wanted to study for free. The monasteries had good schools of general knowledge, and many Jewish women ran away from home to the monasteries. We're talking on 2,000 registered cases, that much in Poland. We have the Maria Vita monasteries of schools, and women were so much eager to engage in studies that they would turn their back to the Jewish tradition that women would not study. The very famous story of Agnon, Tehillah, is about a woman who is atoning for her daughter who ran away from her marriage canopy and went into the monastery to study. That's Tehillah. That's a very famous story. That's the core of the story. Anyhow, if they opened a school in Meknes in Morocco, or in Rabat, or in Tunis, or in Iraq, or in Turkey, or any other Jewish community, Kol Israel Chaverim, Alliance schools, the women there would be educated. If they would not open a school, the women would be illiterate because there were no public funds for opening schools for women, only for men. There was not a single Jewish community with no school for men, but there were many Jewish communities that did not allocate any funds for teaching daughters, young women, and older women, none whatsoever. So when Israel had the miraculous happening, which was called the establishment of the State of Israel, and waves of immigration came from all over the world, the people who received the new immigrants from all over were shocked to find out that 58% of all Jewish women who came from the Muslim world were completely illiterate. Jewish women from Europe were illiterate, not in that range, but many of them were illiterate just as well. So the exact number was that 58% of women immigrants from Asia and Africa had never been to school, as compared to 6.3% of those from Europe. 26% of women from Asia and Africa had not completed primary education, as compared to 31% of those from Europe. That is, we're talking on the 6 years of the Second World War, which had disturbed the lives of children, girls and boys and adults. So the astonishing number that 31% from Europe, European women, and 26% of Asian and African women had not completed primary education. 13% of those from Asia and Africa had completed primary education, as compared to 40% of those from Europe. And it goes on and on like that. All those numbers were collected by the Israel Bureau of Statistics and detailed by Professor Moshe Sikron, the major statistical officer. And the result was that in Israel, there were many people, especially many women, who had no access to any language, and they could not participate in elections. They could not read the letters of the different parties. And the people who were responsible on education said that there must be a national operation to eradicate illiteracy. As a child, as a youngster, I participated as a very minor member of the troops of eradicating illiteracy. I was teaching women in the 60s, as I said, from 64 to 67, in settlements next to Jerusalem, in Mevaseret Zion and the Castle. who never had a clue how to read and write. They were very desperate because the places that they came from, everything was open, like you could see sugar or you could see salt or you could smell pepper, but in the shops in Israel, everything was in containers, and not transparent containers, but blocked containers or colored containers, and they did not know to differentiate between salt and sugar or pepper or anything like that. They wanted to study the Hebrew language so they would be able to know what is the number of the bus that is coming, what is the kind of food that they're looking for. It was very, very hard. People who did not study first language in their childhood find it extremely hard to decipher the connection between signs and sound in a language which is not theirs. I was working very hard in teaching, exactly as all the other members of my troop in the scouts and people from my school. We were taken by small buses to the places next to Jerusalem twice a week, and we were sitting and trying to teach them, and it was very, very disappointing. The more we tried, the less they were able to do so. And I witnessed in my own eyes how tragic is illiteracy. What does it mean to be dependent on somebody else to read a letter from your child, or a medical certificate from the doctor, or any numbers or any bills that you receive? They were completely incompetent. And as I said, 58% of all women who came from Muslim lands were in this situation. That affected tragically the history of Aliyah Uklita, because many efforts were done to help everyone, but many, many women were completely illiterate. As you mentioned, the study I conducted among my friends, and all of them are highly educated, people who are in their 60s and 70s, many of them are doctors and psychiatrists and professors, but their own grandmothers were completely illiterate, including quite a few of them who came from Argentina, who lives in Jerusalem. They said that their grandmothers ran away on their life from Russia, from Poland, from Galicia, and so on, and they never had a chance to learn to study, to read and write. So,
let's talk a bit about literature.
about what?
Literature. Sorry. The unknown history of Jewish women is now very well known, thanks to your book, and also to a new generation of Israeli women writers who began to write poetry and romances about the women in their own families, women secluded inside their homes, subjected to forced ignorance, subjected to forced marriages at the age of 12 or 14, to much older and sometimes violent men. And finally, the circle of silence is being broken, and we have for the first time the feminine perspective in writing. What is the role, in your view, of this new literature in creating awareness and empathy to the plight of Jewish women, of women in general, and all other underprivileged persons in today's society?
Thank you, Suzana, for this question. That reminds me that I need to remind everyone that the people of the book had a library of 100,000 volumes. From the beginning of the printing press, Hebrew printing press is from 1469 until the year 1900. There were 100,000 volumes, each volume different, 100,000 volumes of Hebrew writing. It would be holy writing, secular writing, poetry, travelogues, medical writing, scientific writing, philosophy, Kabbalah, Midrash, Piyut, you name it, Jewish men wrote on every topic. But 100% of this library belongs only to the male members of society. We don't have any women voice from the prophetess Deborah to the Deborah Baron. Prophetess Deborah is the second millennium before the Common Era. Deborah Baron is from the beginning of the 20th century. Now, let me clarify. There were few women who wrote in Yiddish, but I'm talking on a Hebrew language books. There were few women who wrote in Yiddish. There was maybe one woman who wrote in Ladino. There might be one woman who wrote in Arabic. There were women who wrote in German, but there was not a single Jewish writer of the female kind who wrote a book in Hebrew that would be published by her on her own lifetime, a book that would be acknowledged as valuable, as meaningful, as part of the cultural cycles of the Jewish people. There was one book published in Russia that was considered to be shund, meaning garbage, a book which has no value. There was one woman who wrote like what we would call today a romantic romance. Fine, but that would not be the beginning of Hebrew literature for women. The beginning, the formal beginning of Hebrew literature that would be written by women in her own lifetime in Hebrew and published by her and not posthumously would be the books of Deborah Baron that would be considered valuable by her literary circles of the time. That's important. Now, since there were no women voices in the Jewish library, none whatsoever, there was no representation of women opinions, of women experience, of women dialogue, of women laws, of women history, of women concern, of women preferences, none whatsoever. There was complete silence. So I call it the half-empty library. The half-empty library of the Jewish people. Only in the 20th century, we have many Jewish women who had the opportunity to go to school, to study, to choose their course of life, and to contribute to the history of their own mothers and grandmothers and great-grandmothers, to mention their own history, each one of them according to the community of her origin. Nowadays, we have fantastic writers who are telling about their illiterate women in Pakistan or in Iran. We have poets who are describing women of Central Asia and women of Iran and Iraq and so on. And we had late writers like Bracha Seri, who wrote wonderful poetry and wonderful literature about her mother, a Yemenite illiterate woman who suffered immensely. So we do have new voices in the Hebrew library of women who are describing the past of their own mothers and grandmothers and are developing new ideas and new courses of expression for their own current present about their past and for the future. I see that our host is telling us that we have to conclude, but if I may, Suzana, before you conclude, I would like very much to take the opportunity to thank many people that had participated in making this Zoom feasible. And first of all, I want to thank Professor Suzana Chwarts and for hosting it, for initiating it, for doing all the organizational work with all her friends and colleagues. And I would like to thank Mr. Eduardo Novogubelski and his wife, Dr. Yara Novogubelski, who were very eminent in organizing it. I would love to thank Dr. Julia Brauch from the Greuter publication, who was very helpful, Dr. Jonathan Nadav from the Magnus Press, and Mr. Israel Carmel from the Carmel Publication House that had published the book in Hebrew, Magnus and de Gruyter published together the book in English, and I'm very grateful to the translator, Mr. Shmuel Sermoneta Gertel, who did a wonderful work. And I'm very grateful to Mrs. Dorothy Ross from Canada and to Mrs. Leona Rosenberg, may she rest in peace, that had helped in funding the translation of the book, which is a very costly enterprise. And last but not the least, I would love to thank my family who supports the long range of work on Hebrew and English books. So thank you, everyone, and thank you, our dear hostess. And now, Suzana, to you.
Kalita, are we finishing it? I still have 1-2 questions, but
we have a problem because our translator he needs to finish. A gente pode até continuar aqui na sala, mas já sem
We
a
can
tradução.
continue here in the Zoom, but without interpretation after that. And I'd like to, before we finalize, I'd like to interpret Gustavo, the interpreter that was here with us, Nathan from our technical team that took care of the transmission as well, Fernanda that was also here in the monitoring of this room, welcoming people that were arriving. It is a very big team that is in the background and working with us, and it's very good for us to listen to, and at the same time that there is such a big gap of women writers in our Hebrew library. It's amazing to have 2 writer women that are here with us that not only write and share their knowledge, but also that go through, they look into the past and they see these stories and they bring to light these stories that we need to transform, and it's our role to do that. So I'd like to thank everyone who's here, and now I pass the floor back to Suzana to ask and finalize. Okay.
It's the last question I'll make. And
thank you, the translator, Mr. Gustavo. Thank you very much.
Without the translation,
you're welcome.
So I say to the public, make an effort. Okay. It is, we have discussed the title of your book. We have discussed the subtitle of the book. Now, for a moment, let's discuss the author of the book. Rachel, you wrote many books in this book. I am enormously grateful for everything I learned in your book. All through your book, I read maybe more than 100 times the word exclusion, together with other fierce words like segregation, subjugation, erasure, oblivion. Your voice throughout the book sounded to me as an outcry: know, acknowledge, learn, act. Now, it really surprised me that you chose to conclude this vast, profound, encyclopedic book with 3 pages. And in those last pages, I read a word that appeared only once in the whole book. And this word, for me, opened a whole spectrum of understanding. This word was tikkun, actually 2 words.